The candle flame flickered in the window of the stone cottage on the hill above the village of Ashbourne in Derbyshire, a single point of light in the darkness of an October evening in 1349, the only sign of life in a settlement that had once housed more than 300 souls, and that now stood almost entirely dark and silent, its lanes empty, its cottages abandoned, its church door barred, the pestilence having swept through with such devastating completeness that of all the households that had existed just 6 months earlier, only this one cottage remained inhabited. Only this one family had survived intact when every other family in the village had been touched by death, had lost fathers or mothers or children or entire households to the terrible disease that had come from the east and that had transformed the landscape of England from a land of crowded villages and bustling market towns into a realm of empty houses and silent streets and graves so numerous that the churchyards could not hold them all. In that cottage, by the light of that single candle, sat Agnes Carpenter, 52 years old, widow of the village carpenter who had died not of plague, but of a fall from a roof 3 years earlier, and she was surrounded by the 6 people who constituted her entire world now that the plague had taken everyone else, her 3 adult children with their spouses and her 2 young grandchildren, and together they were trying to decide whether to stay in the village where their family had lived for generations or to abandon it and seek refuge and opportunity elsewhere in a world that had been turned upside down by the greatest catastrophe that anyone could remember or that the chronicles recorded, a catastrophe that had killed perhaps half the population of England, and that had left the survivors facing questions that had no precedent and no obvious answers about how to continue, how to rebuild, how to make sense of a world where God as providence seemed to have failed so catastrophically, and where all the certainties and structures that had governed life for centuries had been shaken to their foundations. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Agnes had lived in Ashbourne. All her life had been born in this very cottage, where her father had been the carpenter before her husband, had married at 16, and had raised her 3 children in this same building that now represented the sole continuity between the world before the plague and whatever world might emerge from its aftermath. The cottage was solidly built of local stone with a slate roof, one of the more substantial dwellings in a village where most houses were timber-framed with thatched roofs, built by Agnes' grandfather, who had prospered modestly as a craftsman, serving not just Ashbourne, but the surrounding villages and farms. The cottage had 2 rooms on the ground floor, a main living area with a central hearth and a smaller workroom where Carpenter's tools still hung on the walls, though no one had used them since her husband's death, and a sleeping loft above, reached by a ladder, the whole representing the accumulated wealth and security of 3 generations of skilled craftsmen. The village of Ashbourne that surrounded the cottage had been before the plague a typical market village of the English Midlands, positioned on the road between Derby and Leek, serving as a center for the agricultural communities that surrounded it, hosting a weekly market and an annual fair that drew traders from across the region. The village had supported not just farmers, but also the various craftsmen and merchants necessary for a functioning rural economy. Blacksmiths and carpenters, weavers and tanners, bakers and brewers, a priest to serve the parish church, a Miller, who operated the water mill on the stream that flowed through the valley, an alehouse keeper, several merchants, who bought agricultural produce and sold manufactured goods, and all the other specialists whose labor sustained the complex economic web of medieval village life. The population had been growing for decades before the plague, pressing against the limits of available land, creating the kind of Malthusian pressures that characterized much of 14th century England. Too many people for the available resources, land fragmented into holdings too small to adequately support families, wages depressed by abundant labor, rents raised by landlords who could demand almost any terms from desperate tenants, periodic food shortages. When harvests failed, high mortality, particularly among children and the elderly, whose bodies were weakened by inadequate nutrition. Life had been hard for most of Ashbourne's inhabitants. Before the plague, a constant struggle to produce enough food and to pay the rents and taxes and tithes that were demanded by lord and church and king. But it had been sustainable life, nonetheless, the village maintaining itself generation after generation through the labor and the endurance of its people. And then, in the spring of 1349, a merchant who had been to Bristol had brought the plague to Ashbourne, had fallen ill in the village and had died within days, his body covered with the dark blotches and the swellings that marked the pestilence, his death unleashing a wave of illness that had swept through the crowded village with terrifying speed. The disease had spread from household to household, from neighbor to neighbor, seeming to pass through the very air that people breathed, or through the slightest contact between healthy and sick. Within weeks, dozens were ill. Within months, more than half the village was dead. And by late summer, the dying had slowed only because there were so few people left to sicken. Agnes had watched in horror as the catastrophe had unfolded, as the village she had known all her life had been systematically destroyed, as friends and neighbors and family had fallen to the disease. She had lost her eldest son, Richard, and his wife, both dead, within days of each other in June, leaving their two small children orphaned. She had lost her daughter-in-law's parents and siblings, an entire household extinguished. She had lost the priest who had baptized her children and who had buried her husband. She had lost the smith and the miller and the baker and so many others whose skills and labor had made village life possible. She had attended more funerals in those terrible months than she had attended in all her previous years combined, had seen the churchyard fill with graves and then overflow so that new burial grounds had to be improvised in fields outside the village. But somehow, inexplicably, miraculously, or randomly, depending on one's theological perspective, Amy's own immediate household had been spared. Her two remaining children, John, who was 30 and who had taken up his father's carpentry trade, and Mary, who was 28 and who had married a farmer from a nearby holding, had both survived along with their spouses. Richard's two orphaned children, 7-year-old Thomas and 5-year-old Elizabeth, had also survived and had been taken into Anna's household. The 6 of them, Agnes and her children, and their families had remained healthy throughout the months of dying, had not developed the fever or the swellings or any of the other symptoms that marked. The plague had hidden in their cottage as much as possible to avoid exposure, emerging only when absolutely necessary to obtain food or to help with burials or to check on others who might need assistance. By September, the dying had stopped. The last victim, old William the ale keeper, had been buried in late August, and since then there had been no new cases, the disease seemingly having burned itself out after consuming most of the village's population. The survivors, fewer than 60 people from a community that had numbered more than 300 before the plague, emerged from their houses to assess the devastation and to try to determine what to do next. The village was a scene of abandonment and decay. Most of the houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their contents looted or decaying where they lay. Gardens had gone to weed. Animals that had been left untended had either died or gone feral. The mill had stopped operating when the miller died. The church stood locked, its services suspended for want of a priest. The market that had been the village's economic heart had not met for months and showed no signs of resuming. The survivors faced overwhelming questions. How could such a small number of people maintain the village and its lands? Who would perform the specialized tasks that the dead craftsman had performed? How would they govern themselves in the absence of the priest and the bailiff and the other authorities who had died? Should they try to continue in Ashbourne, or should they abandon it and seek to join other communities that might have fared better? What claim did they have to the property and the goods left by the dead? How would they survive the coming winter with so little labor to harvest what remained of the crops and to prepare for the cold months ahead? These questions had brought Agnes S. family together in the cottage on this October evening to discuss their future. They sat around the table in the main room, the candle casting flickering shadows on the stone walls, the fire in the hearth providing warmth against the autumn chill. Agnes sat at the head of the table, her position there reflecting both her age and her status as the matriarch of the family, the one who held the cottage and who had the longest memory and the deepest roots in the village. To her right sat John, her son, a serious man who had inherited his father's skill with wood, but who had never had his father's easy confidence. And beside John sat his wife Catherine, a quiet woman from a nearby village who had borne 2 children who had died in infancy before the plague. To Agnes's left sat Mary, her daughter, more outspoken and forceful than her older brother, and beside Mary sat her husband Robert, a farmer who had held 20 acres before the plague, and who now found himself surrounded by empty land that could be claimed if anyone had the labor to work it. The 2 young children, Thomas and Elizabeth, had been sent to the loft to sleep, their presence at the table being unnecessary for the difficult conversation that the adults needed to have. The discussion began with Robert stating bluntly what everyone had been thinking, that Ashbourne as they had known it was finished, that there were not enough people left to maintain the village as a functioning community, that attempting to stay here would mean struggling against impossible odds to keep going in a place that had been devastated beyond recovery. He argued for leaving, for taking what they could carry and moving to a larger town like Derby or even to London, where their skills and labor would be in demand, and where the opportunities for rebuilding lives would be far greater than in the ruins of Ashbourne. Mary supported her husband's position, pointing out that as farmers they needed more than just land. They needed a market for their produce. They needed craftsmen to make and repair tools. They needed neighbors for mutual support and for shared labor during harvest. They needed a functioning community rather than an empty village of ghosts and memories. She argued that staying in Ashbourne would mean isolation and hardship, would mean watching the slow decay of everything they had known, would mean raising children in a place with no future and no prospects. John spoke more hesitantly, acknowledging the force of Robert and Mary S. arguments, but also expressing reluctance to abandon the village where he had been born and where 3 generations of his family were buried. He spoke of his father's as workshop and the tools that represented not just economic value, but family heritage, of the cottage that his grandfather had built and that represented stability and continuity, of the responsibility he felt to maintain the family-esque connection to this place even in the face of the catastrophe that had overtaken it. He suggested that perhaps they should stay at least through the winter, should take time to see whether other survivors might arrive or whether conditions might improve before making the irrevocable decision to leave. Catherine said little, deferring to her husband as was expected of a medieval wife, but when asked her opinion, she quietly supported staying, at least temporarily, noting that traveling in late autumn, with winter approaching, would be dangerous, and that moving to an unfamiliar place would mean starting over with no resources and no connections, whereas here they at least had the cottage and the tools and the knowledge of the land and its possibilities. Agnes listened to her children's arguments, understanding the merits of both positions, feeling the pull of practical considerations toward leaving, and the pull of emotional and historical ties toward staying. She had spent 52 years in this cottage, had raised her children here, had buried her husband from here, had watched 3 generations of village life from these windows. The thought of abandoning it, of walking away and letting the cottage stand empty like all the others, of becoming a refugee seeking charity or opportunity in some unfamiliar place, was profoundly painful. But she also recognized the validity of Robert and Mary's concerns, knew that staying in Ashbourne would mean hardship and isolation, knew that the practical challenges might prove overwhelming. As the discussion continued, going over the same ground from different angles, Agnes found herself thinking not just about the immediate practical questions, but about larger issues of meaning and purpose. What was the point of survival if the survivors simply scattered and abandoned everything that had existed before? What responsibility did they owe to the dead, to the community that had been destroyed, to the generations that had built and maintained this village over centuries? Was there value in continuity and rootedness even when it required sacrifice? Or was the wise course to be flexible and mobile, to go where opportunities existed rather than clinging to places that no longer offered viability? She thought, too, about the children, about Thomas and Elizabeth, who had lost their parents and who looked to her now for security and guidance, and about whatever children John and Catherine and Mary and Robert might yet have if they survived and prospered. What kind of world did she want those children to inherit? Should they be raised in an empty village surrounded by the physical remnants of catastrophe? Or should they be raised in a bustling town where they would know nothing of the old world and the old ways, but where they might have better material prospects? These questions had no easy answers, and Agnes knew that whatever decision they made would have profound consequences, not just for the immediate practical matters of where to live and how to make a living, but for the family's identity and its relationship to its own history. She called for a pause in the discussion, suggesting that they should each spend the next day in prayer and reflection, seeking divine guidance, and also simply giving themselves time to think clearly about such an important decision without the pressure of trying to resolve it immediately in one evening as conversation. The family agreed to this, and they dispersed to their sleeping places, Agnes to her bed in the ground floor room, where she had slept with her husband for 3 decades, and where she now slept alone, John and Catherine to the loft, Mary and Robert to the small workroom, where they had made a temporary bedroom, the children already asleep in their corner of the loft. Agnes lay awake for a long time after the others had settled, listening to the night sounds of the village, which is to say listening to almost nothing, to the wind moving through the empty cottages, to the distant sound of a dog barking, to the profound silence that had replaced the normal nighttime sounds of a living community. The next day was Sunday, and the family attended Mass in the church, or what passed for Mass now that there was no priest. One of the surviving villagers, a man named Edward, who had some education and some memory of the Latin prayers, led the service as best he could, reading from the Missal and attempting to replicate the familiar rituals, even though he lacked the authority to consecrate the host or to provide absolution or to perform the other sacramental functions that required ordination. It was an inadequate substitute for proper worship, but it was better than nothing, a way of maintaining connection to the faith and the traditions that had sustained the community through the generations. After the service, Agnes walked through the village, something she had done countless times in her life, but that now felt different, felt like she was walking through a cemetery or a museum rather than through a living community. She passed the houses where friends and neighbors had lived, saw the empty doorways and the shuttered windows, noted the signs of decay that were already appearing after just a few months of abandoned mud thatch sagging on roofs, walls, showing cracks gardens. Completely overgrown, the whole physical fabric of the village beginning to deteriorate without the constant maintenance that had kept it functional. She walked to the churchyard and spent time at the graves of her family, her husband's marked grave, and the mass graves where Richard and his wife, and so many others lay buried together in haste during the worst of the plague. She prayed for their souls, and she talked to them in her mind, asking for guidance, telling them about the decision she faced, wishing that they could somehow respond and tell her what to do. But the dead were silent, as they always were, and Agnes was left to find her own way forward. As she walked back toward her cottage, Agnes encountered a few of the other survivors going about their own Sunday activities. She stopped to talk with each of them, asking about their plans, trying to gauge whether there was any possibility of enough people staying in Ashbourne to maintain it as a viable community. What she heard was discouraging. Most of the survivors were planning to leave, to move to other villages or towns where they had relatives or where opportunities seemed better. Some had already gone, leaving in the weeks since the dying had stopped, taking what they could carry and abandoning their homes to emptiness and decay. Of the 60 or so people who had survived the plague in Ashbourne, Agnes estimated that perhaps 20 remained, and most of those were preparing to leave once they had settled their affairs and made arrangements for where to go. This information clarified Agnes's thinking considerably. If most of the other survivors were leaving, then staying in Ashbourne would mean living in an almost entirely empty village with perhaps a handful of other households isolated from the social networks and the economic exchanges that made village life functional and meaningful. It would mean watching the village continue to decay around them, would mean struggling to maintain a household. Without the support of the wider community, would mean living among ruins and memories rather than among living neighbors and active commerce. By the time Agnes returned to her cottage, she had made her decision. She gathered her family together and told them that she believed they should leave Ashbourne, that while the choice was painful and while it meant abandoning the family's roots and heritage, the practical realities were too overwhelming to ignore that staying would mean condemning themselves and especially the children to hardship and isolation that served no good purpose that their duty was to the living and to the future, rather than to the dead and the past. The family received this decision with mixed emotions, relief from Robert and Mary, who had been advocating for leaving, resignation from John, who had hoped to stay, but who accepted his mother's judgment, quiet satisfaction from Catherine, who had wanted to leave, but had not wanted to be the one to insist on it. They agreed that they would leave in the spring, after the winter had passed, and when traveling would be safer, giving them time to prepare carefully, rather than departing in haste and potentially arriving at their destination with inadequate resources. The winter of 1349 to 1350 was thus spent in preparation for departure. The family worked to preserve food for the journey and for establishing themselves in their new location, salting meat and drying vegetables, and carefully storing grain. They sold what they could of the family's possessions that were too bulky to transport easily, though finding buyers was difficult when so few people remained, and when most of them were also leaving. They made inquiries about destinations, sending letters through merchants and travelers to contacts in Derby and other towns, seeking information about opportunities and conditions. Agnes herself spent part of the winter sorting through the family's possessions and memories, deciding what to take and what to leave, what was essential and what was merely sentimental. She went through her husband's tools, selecting the best to take and giving the rest to the few remaining villagers who might have use for them. She sorted through clothing and household goods, taking what was needed and practical and leaving the rest. She looked through the few documents the family possessed, records of land holdings, contracts for work. Her husband had done letters from relatives in other places, and she preserved those that might be useful while discarding those that would serve no purpose in the new life they would build. But most difficult was the emotional work of preparing to leave, of saying goodbye to a place that had been home for so long, of accepting that the community she had known all her life was ending and would not be restored, that the world before the plague was gone and could not be recovered, that the future would be different in fundamental ways from the past. Agnes found herself walking through the village repeatedly during those winter months, visiting places that held memories, saying farewell to a landscape and a community that would soon exist only in her recollection. As winter turned to spring and the time for departure approached, the family made final preparations. They had decided to go to Derby, which was a substantial town that had been affected by the plague, but that still maintained a functioning economy and community, where John's carpentry skills would be in demand and where Robert could find work as a laborer while seeking to acquire land on more favorable terms than had been possible before the plague. They had received letters from contacts in Derby indicating that there were indeed opportunities for industrious families, that the town was actively seeking new residents to help rebuild its depleted population, that housing and work were available. On a morning in early April of 1350, the family loaded their possessions onto a cart that Robert had obtained and onto the backs of the 2 horses and the donkey that they owned. They packed carefully the tools and the goods and the food they would need, leaving behind the bulkier furniture and the things that were too heavy or too impractical to transport. Agnes took a final walk through the cottage, through the rooms where she had spent her entire married life, touching the walls and the hearth and the windows, as if committing them to memory through physical contact. She looked out from the door at the village spreading below, at the church and the empty houses and the fields beyond, at the landscape that had been the horizon of her world for 5 decades. And then she closed the door behind her, for the last time and joined her family at the cart, and together they began the journey down the hill and out of Ashbourne, becoming part of the great migration that the plague had set in motion as survivors across England and across Europe left devastated communities and sought new beginnings in places that offered better prospects. As they walked, Agnes looked back several times at the cottage on the hill, watching it recede into the distance, the last house that had remained occupied in a village that was now being completely abandoned to silence and emptiness. The journey to Derby took 2 days, the family traveling slowly with the loaded cart and the children stopping for the night at a church where the priest allowed them to shelter and to stable their animals. They arrived in Derby on a mild spring afternoon, and they were struck immediately by the contrast with Ashbourne, where Ashbourne had been nearly empty and silent. Derby was busy and active, its streets filled with people going about their business, its markets operating, its workshops producing, its churches celebrating services. The plague had clearly taken a terrible toll here as well. There were empty buildings and signs of abandonment. The population was visibly reduced from what it had been, but the town was still functioning as a living community rather than as a dying one. The family found temporary lodging at an inn and began the process of establishing themselves in their new home. John quickly found work as a carpenter, his skills being in high demand in a town where many craftsmen had died and where there was much repair and construction work to be done on buildings that had been neglected during the plague months. Robert found work as a general laborer and began looking for land that he might rent or purchase on the favorable terms that the post-plague scarcity of labor had made possible. Mary found work helping at the inn where they were staying, her experience managing a household translating well to the work of hospitality. Catherine helped care for the children and managed the family's domestic arrangements in the temporary quarters. Agnes herself took on the role of family matriarch and manager, overseeing the finances, maintaining connections with the extended family and with contacts they had in Derby, serving as the anchor and the continuity for the family as they navigated the challenges of adapting to a new place and a new life. She found the adjustment difficult in many ways. She missed Ashbourne despite having chosen to leave, missed the familiar landscapes and the known faces, missed the sense of belonging and rootedness that came from living in a place where she knew every lane and every building and every family. Derby felt strange and alien to her, its streets confusing, its people unfamiliar, its rhythms and patterns different from what she had known. But she also recognized that the family had made the right decision in leaving. The opportunities in Derby were real. John was earning more as a carpenter than he ever could have in Ashbourne. Robert was negotiating to rent a substantial farm on terms that would have been impossible before the plague. The children were growing up in a community that offered education and social connections and prospects rather than in an empty village of ghosts. The family was surviving and even beginning to prosper, was building a new life from the wreckage of the old one, was demonstrating the resilience and adaptability that would characterize the plague survivors throughout England. The months and years that followed saw the family become gradually more settled in Derby. John established himself as a respected craftsman, built a solid client base, eventually took on an apprentice, became prosperous enough to purchase a house rather than continuing to rent. Robert successfully negotiated a lease on 60 acres of good farmland, far more than he could have hoped to work before the plague, when land had been scarce and competition for it intense. and he began to build up herds and to produce substantial crops using the labor of his own family supplemented by hired workers during harvest. Mary and Catherine managed their households, raised their children, for both had babies in the years after the move to Derby, and contributed to the family's economic activities in the various ways that medieval women did. Agnes lived to see her grandchildren grow, lived to see the family establish itself successfully in Derby, lived to see the immediate post-plague crisis give way to something approaching normalcy as society adapted to the changed circumstances. She lived to see Thomas, her eldest grandson, who had been orphaned by the plague, reach adulthood and marry and establish his own household, continuing the family line into another generation. She lived to see the town of Derby recover much of its function and vitality, even though its population never returned to pre-plague levels. Lived to see a new equilibrium established that was different from the old world, but that was viable and in some ways better for common people than what had existed before. But she never entirely stopped thinking about Ashbourne, about the cottage on the hill, about the village she had known all her life and that she had left behind. She wondered sometimes whether anyone still lived there, whether the cottage stood empty or whether some new family had claimed it, whether the village had been completely abandoned or whether some remnant of community remained. She wondered whether she would ever return, even just to visit, to see what had become of the place where she had spent most of her life and where so much of her family's history was embedded. In the autumn of 1365, when Agnes was 68 years old and feeling the weight of her years, she decided to make the journey back to Ashbourne. Her health was failing, and she knew she did not have many years left, and she wanted to see once more the place where she had lived for so long, wanted to visit the graves of her husband and her son, and the others she had lost, wanted to know what had become of the cottage and the village, in the 15 years since she had left. John accompanied her on the journey, the two of them traveling on horseback on a fine October day, retracing the route they had taken in the opposite direction a decade and a half earlier. As they approached Ashbourne and climbed the hill toward where the village had been, Agnes felt her heart beating faster with anticipation and anxiety, unsure what she would find, whether the cottage would still stand or whether it would have collapsed into ruins like so much else from the pre-plague world. What she found surprised her. The village was not entirely abandoned as she had expected. Several of the cottages were occupied, showing signs of life, smoke from chimneys, animals in yards, washing, hanging to dry. Fields around the village were under cultivation, though far fewer than before the plague, and in different patterns. The church was open and apparently in use, its door no longer barred, its bell tower intact. Ashbourne had not recovered to anything like its former size or vitality, but it had not died completely either. Some small community had persisted or had re-established itself, had kept the village alive in diminished form, and the cottage, her family's cottage, still stood. It was occupied. Agnes could see smoke rising from its chimney, the doors standing open on this mild autumn day, the garden showing signs of cultivation. Agnes sat on her horse looking at the cottage for a long time, flooded with memories, with thoughts of the life she had lived there and the people she had loved who were gone. She felt a complex mixture of emotions, sadness at all that had been lost, satisfaction at seeing that the cottage had been maintained, and was serving someone as a home curiosity about who lived there now, a sense of closure and completion at seeing that life continued even in the place she had abandoned. She did not approach the cottage or knock on its door. It belonged to someone else now, whoever had claimed it in the years since her departure, and she had no desire to disturb them or to try to reclaim any connection to it. She had her memories, and that was sufficient. Instead, she rode with John to the churchyard, where they found the graves of family and friends, many now overgrown and neglected, but still identifiable. They spent time there in prayer and remembrance, and then they visited briefly with some of the people who now lived in Ashbourne, learning that the village had stabilized at a population of perhaps 50 people, a fraction of its former size, but enough to maintain basic community functions. That the people who lived there now were a mix of original survivors who had stayed and newcomers who had come seeking available land and housing. Agnes and John returned to Derby that evening, making the journey in one long day, rather than stopping overnight as they had on the outward journey. Agnes was exhausted from the riding and from the emotions of the day, but she was also at peace in a way she had not been since leaving Ashbourne. She had seen that the cottage stood, that the village continued in some form, that abandonment had not meant complete obliteration. She had paid her respects to the dead, and had said her final farewell to the place where she had spent most of her life. She could now live out her remaining years in Derby without the unresolved questions that had nagged at her, could accept that the decision to leave had been the right one, even as she honored the memory of what had existed before. Agnes died in the winter of 1367, surrounded by her family in John's house in Derby. She had lived long enough to see her family firmly established in their new home, to see her grandchildren growing into adults, to see the immediate crisis of the plague give way to the longer process of recovery and adaptation. She was buried in Derby in the churchyard of the parish church, far from Ashbourne and far from her husband's grave, but surrounded by the family she had protected and guided through the catastrophe and its aftermath. The story of Agnes and her family was one story among thousands, among tens of thousands, among hundreds of thousands of similar stories of plague survivors who faced impossible choices and who made decisions that shaped not just their own lives but the trajectory of medieval society. Some, like Agnes, chose to leave devastated communities and to seek opportunities elsewhere, their mobility helping to redistribute population and labor across the post-plague landscape. Others chose to stay in their ancestral villages and to rebuild them despite overwhelming challenges, their persistence maintaining continuity and preserving communities that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Both choices had merit and both had costs. Those who left gained opportunities and escaped the psychological burden of living surrounded by ruins and memories, but they lost their roots and their connection to place and to the graves of their ancestors. Those who stayed maintained continuity and honored the dead by preserving what they had built, but they struggled with isolation and with the practical difficulties of maintaining communities that were too small to be fully viable. Neither choice was clearly right or wrong, and the decision depended on individual circumstances and values and on the particular balance of opportunities and constraints that each family faced. What united both the leavers and the stayers was the challenge of adapting to a fundamentally changed world, of finding ways to continue despite losses that seemed overwhelming, of building new lives and new communities from the wreckage of the old. The The plague had destroyed so much, had killed millions, had disrupted social structures, had undermined faith, had created trauma that would affect generations, but it had not destroyed everything. What remained was sufficient, barely but genuinely sufficient, to allow recovery, to permit the continuation of civilization, to enable the rebuilding of communities and economies and cultures that would eventually create a new equilibrium, different from the pre-plague world, but viable in its own right. The cottage on the hill in Ashbourne, the last house that had remained standing in a village that had come so close to complete extinction, was in its own way a symbol of this survival and this continuity. It had sheltered Agnes and her family through the worst of the plague, had been a refuge and a base for their survival when almost everything around them was collapsing. And after they left, it had sheltered others who needed a home, had continued to serve its purpose as a dwelling place for human families seeking shelter and security, had remained standing through the years and the decades and even the centuries that followed, a physical link between the world before the plague and the world that emerged after. The story of the plague and its aftermath was not primarily a story of death and destruction, though those elements were certainly present and were overwhelming in their magnitude. It was more fundamentally a story of survival and adaptation, of human resilience and creativity in the face of catastrophe, of the capacity to rebuild and to continue, even when continuation seemed impossible. The last house standing in a devastated village was a symbol of this larger truth, that even the worst disasters need not be final, that from the ruins can come renewal, that the human story continues through the darkest chapters and eventually finds its way to something resembling recovery and even eventually to something approaching normalcy. Agnes' decision to leave Ashbourne and her family as successful establishment of new lives in Derby demonstrated one path through the catastrophe, one way of adapting and surviving. The people who stayed in Ashbourne and who maintained the village in diminished form demonstrated another path, equally valid, equally admirable in its own way. Together the leavers and the stayers, the mobile and the rooted, the risk-takers and the continuity maintainers rebuilt English society after the plague, creating a new world that incorporated elements of the old, but that was fundamentally transformed by the experience of having survived the greatest catastrophe in recorded history. The cottage on the hill in Ashbourne continued to stand for centuries after Agnes left it, continuing to shelter families, continuing to provide a physical anchor in a world that had been through such profound disruption. It stood as a reminder that however devastating the plague had been, it had not extinguished life or hope or the human capacity to build homes and families and communities. It stood as a monument to survival, to the choice that Agnes had made to preserve her family by leaving, and to the choice that others had made to preserve the village by staying. It stood as a testament to the simple fact that life continues, that even after the darkest seasons there are survivors, and that from those survivors comes the possibility of renewal and recovery, and eventually of a future that honors the past while moving beyond it. The last house, standing in a village of ghosts, eventually became simply a house in a living village again, as Ashbourne slowly rebuilt its population and its community over the decades and centuries that followed the plague. The particular history of that house and of Agnes' family was forgotten by later generations who knew nothing of the plague years except from stories, who lived in a world so different from the pre-plague era that they could barely imagine what had been lost or how close the community had come to complete extinction. But the physical fact of the cottage's continued existence, the simple reality that it had survived and had continued to provide shelter through all the upheavals of history, was itself a form of memory and a form of testimony to what had been endured and overcome. Agnes, in her old age in Derby, sometimes thought about that cottage and wondered whether future generations would ever know its story, would ever understand what it had represented in the darkest days of the plague. She thought about the candle in the window that had been the only light in a dark village, thought about the family gathered around the table, making the decision that would shape their future, thought about the morning when they had closed the door for the last time and had set out on the journey that would lead them to new lives in a new place. And she hoped that somehow, in some way, the story would be remembered not for any particular importance of her own family, but as an example of what all the plague's survivors had faced, and how they had found ways to continue despite losses that seemed unbearable. The story was remembered in fragments and in distortions in family traditions and in local histories, in the physical evidence of the cottage itself and of the patterns of landholding and population that the plague had disrupted and that had then reorganized in new configurations. It was remembered imperfectly, as all history is remembered imperfectly, with details lost and timelines confused and interpretations shaped by the concerns and assumptions of later generations. But it was remembered nonetheless, and it contributed to the larger understanding of how the Black Death had transformed medieval society, and how the survivors had responded to the challenge of rebuilding civilization from its ruins. The last house, standing in Ashbourne in the autumn of 1349, with its single candle burning in the window, as a sign that life persisted even in a village of death, was more than just a physical structure. It was a symbol of hope in the midst of catastrophe, of determination to survive, of the human refusal to accept despair and extinction as the final word. It was a beacon that had guided Agnes and her family through the decisions they needed to make, and it remained a beacon in memory, reminding later generations that even the darkest times can be survived, that even the worst disasters can be overcome, that even when everything seems lost, there remains the possibility of continuity and renewal and recovery. And as is life from her birth in the cottage on the hill, through her decades of raising a family and surviving the plague to her final years in Derby, watching her grandchildren grow was in its essentials an ordinary life, the kind of life that millions of medieval people live without leaving any particular mark on history beyond the simple fact of their existence. But that ordinary life lived through extraordinary times was itself extraordinary in its demonstration of human resilience and adaptability, in its quiet heroism of continuing through catastrophe, in its successful navigation of impossible choices and overwhelming challenges. Agnes was not a hero in any conventional sense. She performed no great deeds, achieved no fame, changed no policies, led no movements. But she survived, and she preserved her family, and she made the hard decisions that her circumstances required, and in doing so she contributed to the larger process by which English society survived the plague and gradually recovered from its effects. The cottage on the hill in Ashbourne, standing empty, now after Agnes left, but soon to be occupied by new families who would make it. Their home was a physical reminder of this larger truth, that individual lives and individual stories, however ordinary they might seem, are part of the great flow of history. that the survival of civilization depends not on heroes and leaders, but on the countless ordinary people who make the daily choices that allow communities to continue. But because it represents the indomitable human determination to survive and to rebuild and to continue the story even when the story seems to have reached its ending. Agnes died at peace, her life complete, her family secure, her duty done. She had survived the greatest catastrophe of her age, had made the hard choices that survival required, had seen her family through the crisis and into a new world. She had left behind the cottage and the village where she had spent most of her life, but she had preserved what was most important, the people she loved, the family line continuing into another generation, the knowledge and the values and the memories that connected past to future. And in the end, that was what survival meant, not preserving everything, which was impossible, but preserving enough to allow continuation, to enable recovery, to permit the story to go on into another chapter and another generation and another era of history. The last house standing became not an ending, but a transition, not a final monument to what had been lost, but a starting point for what would be built anew. And Agnes, who had lived in that house, and who had made the decision to leave it, who had carried her family through the catastrophe and into recovery, was part of that transition, part of the great story of how humanity survives its darkest hours and finds its way, somehow, to dawn and to renewal, and to the continuation of the ancient human project of building homes, and families and communities that give meaning and purpose to our brief lives and that connect us to the long chain of generations, stretching from the distant past into the unknowable future.